Welcome to The Roll Forward, a podcast for the next wave of finance leaders, especially those looking to transform their roles by making smarter, faster, and more profitable business decisions using the power of technology and a forward-looking approach to finance. Listen in to learn how to get out of the back office trenches and become a more strategic partner within your organization.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Roll Forward podcast. My name is Joe Michalowski, and this episode is brought to you by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. And today my guest is Jenny Jao, the head of finance at Sprig, and she is at a company that's streamlining the user research process. Jenny, thanks so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. Before we get into main topic, do you mind just giving everyone the quick background on yourself, how you got to Sprig, and what you do there now?
Yeah, of course. I'm the finance at Sprig. We gave the intro of what we do. We are a research platform helping companies improve product experience, mostly by collecting insights across the product development lifecycle. I started Sprig through a cold LinkedIn message from our VP of Ops. I was at a publicly traded company, not actively looking to make a move, always within a startup. So after learning more about the role, product, and the team, it just evolved into an opportunity that I couldn't pass up. And then prior to Sprig, I was at Blackline, which is a publicly traded software business. Spent some time in technology before that. I started my career in investment.
I love all that. Finance software near and dear to our heart. So love that background as well. And by the time this goes live, I guess this cat will kind of be out of the bag, but you were nominated for our first awards program lineup, which is like the Movers of Strategic Finance, and by your head of ops. And he sent a very nice nomination message and was singing your praises about one particular topic. And it was about building an operating model for Sprig. And so that is what we're going to focus on today, because what I heard is that the flexibility you brought to this operating model was really important to what he cared about and what the business cared about. And so to set the stage on that, do you mind walking us through sort of when you got to Sprig? What was the financial modeling sort of environment like? What did they have? Or what did they not have? And what were you hoping to achieve by building this new model out?
Sure. I was lucky that there was a basic forecast model, so I had something to work with. And the structure of our data in both the accounting and the analytics platform was actually quite organized. So I had just good bones to work with. Piece that was missing were financials were just in separate Google sheets. Assumptions were hard-coded in different places. So it made it difficult to audit and obviously error control. So with all the inconsistencies and likely human error, having it across different spreadsheets, my number one priority was just to bring it all together in a consolidated model. And wanted to make sure that, given the maturity that we were in, that we had the appropriate level of detail while maintaining a degree of flexibility. So in my case, we have a number of bottoms-up builds, particularly when we don't have really reliable historical data for spending. And that just gives me a little bit more comfort around forecast accuracy. And then on the other hand, when things change so quickly, I have built the model to flex in a lot of different ways. And that way we can put in different assumptions, which scenario, plan, and see what they would spit out. And building in prerequisite is also really helpful to just provide that extra level of work.
Yeah, I think when I saw that the goal was kind of to build flexibility around the model, I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, because, for our target audience, it's a lot of like Series A to D startups, and everything changes all the time. And so having this kind of like rigid model just doesn't make sense. And so it's why I really like this topic a lot, because, really, I think like the bones of financial models that I hear leaders like yourself talk about are usually the same. Like we talk about it's like these building blocks. It's your top line planning, your headcount planning, your income statement, your balance sheet. But everyone has like a slightly different, like nuanced approach. So I'm curious, like, it sounds like I appreciate the insight into like the bottoms up builds, but do you mind giving a little bit more about how you approached building the model, what the process looked like, and like how long this actually took you when you got there?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I say it is different for there are slight differences across companies. I think, in my experience, seen it built in several different ways. The first thing I like to take it in three steps. So the first step is understanding the key drivers of the system. And so to me, because the model is really just a tool to help you reflect the purpose, you want to be able to take the key drivers and drive the model off of that. So every company could be very different. It could be like, how do you build your revenue? It could be how do you build your expenses? So obviously that's the first step. And then the second step is understanding what views and metrics are relevant to your key stakeholders. So that would include your executive team, include your board. And what I mean by that is it's less about the output, because you can always build output off of, the model and be cut in a lot of different ways. What I really mean is definition of those metrics and also the model structure. So for example, if your stakeholders want to see pipeline based on enterprise and mid-market split, your model is built in that way. And so I like to be mindful of that. And then the third step is model. And I have a particular style of setting up my model, and some of this comes from my days in investment banking. So I like to have all three statements in one tab. To me, it's easier to visualize, synthesize. Granted, if your preference is to have it in separate tabs, by all means, do what's comfortable for you.
Yeah. I
also like to have all my assumptions in one tab, and it just makes it cleaner to know what variables to flex. And so that I found out. Otherwise, you also run the risk of forgetting an assumption that's hard coded into the model. For SaaS, software as a service, the two most important builds in my mind are the ARR, which is current revenue build, and account. So the ARR build includes your pipeline assumptions, your new ARR, or some people call it booking, turning into percent, your sales like SDR ramp schedule. I like to look at ARR in two different ways. One is conversion of that pipeline, and then two is sales quota attainment. And to me, like using this methodology is a good way to try and be able to make sure the assumptions I'm running through the model make sense. And then on the headcount build, I guess it's pretty self-explanatory, but includes new hire plan, comp increases, commission payout, employees. And I like to build it at this stage. I like to build it down to the individual. And when you hit a certain level of maturity, probably could get away with just the team level. So.
Yeah, love all of that. I think I like that you're talking about personal preferences and what this actually looks like. It's not a side of this conversation I get that often. I realize like it's a little nitty gritty. And so usually when I ask this question, people like don't think that maybe you want that information, but I love that information. So it's nice to hear kind of how these can be personalized, because I know like just by hearing people talk about it differently, that it's so different for everyone. Logistical question, like, so you step into Sprig, and how long does this take you to build? I feel like I know they can be pretty beastly. So I'm just curious like what the end-to-end timeline looked like.
For sure. Honestly, with a more complicated business model, with Sprig business model is currently on the simpler side. So I would say I typically give myself a week to build, mostly and it's not the building piece that takes a while, it's the iterating and aligning on assumptions, and it's the back and forth with stakeholders. So that piece takes a few extra days. And then on the monthly updates and reforecasting, I say maybe a few days, there's inevitably going to be something that's doesn't look quite right when you look at the samples. So you have to go back and check to see what's driving that. I always like to be able to explain variances between actuals and forecasts, so that takes a while to talk out, and be able to explain why the numbers are the way they are. And then I've also spent time reviewing the financials with business partners. So, for example, it'd be like the CTO or the head of engineering, your go-to-market leaders. I have a department level budget that I provide to them at the end of the month, or I guess rather at the beginning of the following month. And I also ask them about their expectations for the rest of the month or the rest of the quarter. And that gives me a better insight with how I should forecast through the rest of the year. And because our business keeps changing, these assumptions actually move quite a bit month to month. So I do want to make sure that I have the latest and greatest in model.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I think it rolls back to the flexibility conversation we had. I think obviously, like, I think the ideal is to be as agile and sort of flexible as you can. And I just don't think a lot of companies are there. And so I think it was it Sean who was the CEO or the head of ops. So I think it is why he was probably so excited. He was like, oh wow, somebody came in and they got this done, because this is not easy.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk a little bit about the challenges, because it's hard enough to do that it prevents companies from being flexible at all. They just have like their annual operating plan and they're kind of stuck in it for a while.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, like, what were some of the biggest roadblocks that you hit along the way while you were trying to build this out?
Yeah, the biggest challenge, and I think, startups will find this relevant, is the lack of historical data. So we have, maybe 6 months that we can find off of because we've made all these changes. And it's not necessarily like a business pivot. If you just see the go-to-market motion or the way you staff up your engineering, whatever it may be, like the big changes like that make it difficult to find. So I've had to get a bit creative on how I forecast line items. The other pieces, for example, with COVID, travel and entertainment has been a line item that's been very different in the last couple of years. So how do you think about that in the next 12 months to 18 months? And if you want to try to meet beyond that, like you want a 3 to 5 year model, then that's even more challenging. So I would say that's probably the biggest issue I have.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, I work in content, so I don't have to do this, but I can't imagine trying to plan out what a startup is going to look like in 3 years. And so, I mean, even a large company, but things just change so quickly. Even like if you're just a department, like someone outside of finance, like, that the company is evolving all the time. Like your pricing changes, your packaging changes, I don't know, you decide that you're going to be product led all of a sudden because you add a new product line, and now it's just a whole extra nuance to it. And so really love that all of this is kind of about staying flexible and building in that agility where you can. So the historical data, the trend data, I assume this is part of the next question, but I'm curious if there are others. But, you're coming from Blackline, and so it's massive company versus startup. And so other than, obviously Blackline having a lot more historical data to work off of, are there any other points of comparison or challenges that you dealt with at Sprig that are different from when you were at that large company?
Yeah. So I'd say like it's all about how the data is structured. In the challenge, that's probably the biggest challenge. It's like like what might be easier that don't have the level of complexity. We don't have as many products. We don't have an international market. So we don't have to take into account a lot of that detail that I have to deal with at Blockline. But what's more complicated is, the model is sensitive and very sensitive to the assumptions. So it's more than just the lack of historical data. It's any assumption I put in right now can really move the needle. And maybe it's, tens of thousands of dollars here versus Blacklight. I can get away with tens of thousands of, it might be an issue if it's like millions of dollars. The different like reference and margin for error.
Yeah, rounding errors versus we took it to the board and we got a number wrong, and now all of a sudden, like, we're growing 2x instead of 3.5x, and it's like, oh, well, this is a very different looking startup than it was a minute ago.
Totally.
So yeah, totally hear that. I like getting the perspective of the two different sides, because so many of the people I talk to and the experience I have is all in startups, and so I really like when people come in and they can kind of give that future look. It's like, hey, this is where you're heading. Like, this is what you're going to deal with later. So really like that. I think the last kind of broad question I have about the operating model you built is about Sprig specifically. Are there any, like, I know you said that the model or the business model and everything is relatively simple at this stage. Are there any nuances or complexities that are unique to Sprig that you had to manage based on, I don't know, maybe the products you sell or certain ways that you run the business in different departments? Like, are there ways that you had to build this model to adhere to Sprig's sort of nuance as a business?
I would say it follows a pretty traditional SaaS model.
Nice.
So the revenue build is pretty standard. And even though, we take the pricing method, which is different from that, so it's probably more popular among SaaS. Even then, like from a modeling standpoint, it doesn't really affect how I build it. And that's mainly because I'm not taking price and quantity. I'm taking like conversion to pipe and quota attainment. So it's just a different CO. On the expense side, I'd say I don't think there's anything that similar either with headcount. Company has that in
It's headcount.
different functions. We would benefit, like maybe there's some differences in what the numbers are because our health benefits might be different. But other than that, from what I can tell, it's not that different. It's mostly just like what the numbers actually are. But yeah, over time, like if we launch a different product and we want to price that differently and we're going to comp our reps differently, potentially that could introduce a little bit more nuance that doesn't exist today.
Yeah, I guess the way I'd probably sum it was like, it's not easy now, but it's simple. And so you got to like enjoy these early days while you don't have some of that extra complexity as it moves along. But yeah, again, I'm sure it's never an easy task, but at least you don't have some like crazy pricing model on the side. It's like, I need to build this whole thing from scratch. So good to hear. It's probably a better answer than if we had to dig into 30 minutes of some crazy thing you had to do with the model to adhere to the business model. You mentioned both of these earlier. You mentioned the ARR build, the revenue build, and headcount planning. And I want to get deeper into both of those because they are the toughest parts of any model as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And they kind of set the stage for the rest of the business. Like if you get those wrong, like that your plan is kind of meaningless. So I know you mentioned kind of quota attainment. So it sounds like you're doing, well, actually, let's start with the ARR build. And if you're doing quota attainment, it sounds like you're doing like a sales capacity kind of model. You talked about bottoms up models, but can you just give another breakdown of how you approached it, why you chose that model for Sprig as opposed to, or I guess like what other options you considered? Curious, like what that process was when you got in.
Yeah. So when it comes to sales capacity, to me, that's the most tangible way to get ARR because your reps they're rewarded in a certain number. And so typically, especially at larger companies, I would say that's the methodology that and I would say also at a larger company, your attainment number has more historical data that you can pretty easily like rely on whatever that percentage is. And you also design your quota in a way where it's like there's a number that can increase consistent. For startups, maybe a little less relevant because the performance might ebb and flow a bit more. And that's natural, I would say. Part of that is the sales process is still hiring. Still hiring, your reps and they're still ramping. So there's a large percentage of ramping reps, which also introduces volatility. But overall, I would say the Noteworthy method that I would always build, I probably spend more time on the pipeline conversion model right now at Sprig just because there's more emphasis there. We focus a lot on pipeline generation, what is likelihood of that pipeline closing, when, and where is it coming from, like what source channel, and where, like what size businesses are coming through the door, enterprises, market, etc. And so because of all of the attention around these particular metrics across, the executive team, I spent a lot of time there. We also use it to set targets for not just necessarily our sales team, but also our marketing, any pipeline generation. So there are a lot of stakeholders in that right now. And then from a revenue build standpoint, all I focus on once I get pipeline and understand like what the numbers are there, it's more around like what the conversion rates are. And that's probably the piece that I have the least comfort right now because conversion can vary quite a bit depending on what we're testing and we're not, we're not a big great kind of data there. But overall, like all that pipeline data feeds into what I call new logo revenue or new logo ARR. And then once you have a good sense of what that number is, then you look at what your account growth revenue is, which is the revenue from existing customers. And then you look at your churn and attrition assumption, basically revenue that you expect to lose. I would say, given where we are today in the environment, probably with more of that here. And then those three pieces, you aggregate that, and that gets your ARR, and get it down to revenue, just it's the revenue range. So that's how I would approach the top line build, and that's not that dissimilar from what I used to look at. It's which build is more reliable.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've talked about at Mosaic, we know that sales capacity model with the commission rates and the on-target earnings and the sales rep ramp, like that is a very standard way to do it. So we offer a template. The one that we don't talk as much about is this pipeline kind of approach that you were talking about. So I would love to know a little bit more about, like, I'm guessing, because I don't do this work, so correct me if I'm wrong, you need to start with kind of the pipeline assumption. So if you're a startup, you can't, I don't think you can just like build it off of historicals. Like, oh, our pipeline was this in Q2. So in Q3, we're going to bump it up by 10% because you need to grow a lot more than that. So how do you decide kind of what the starting point is as a business? Is that just tops down based on like what the revenue targets are? I'm curious like how you approach that.
It's a bit of both. So we everything, we get it down to the sourcing team level. So for example, marketing based on a pipeline spend ratio, and there's like targets that we set there. So basically, for every dollar of marketing spend, how much of pipeline are we expecting from that dollar? And then that gives you what your marketing pipeline should look like. And we also segment that by enterprise versus mid-market, mainly because our sales cycle is so different and we want to make sure the pipeline is converting. We want to see how the pipeline is converting. And then with SDRs, it is based on like a meeting target. So what are your top of funnel messages is what I would use. And for us, it's and we have, set targets. We figure out how many they need to create to get to some level of pipeline. And then once you look at, and then, you apply average deal size to that to get to a dollar value. And then you look across, you have a few other sourcing channels. But once you get that mix, then you can also stare at it and see if that's the right mix that you have in mind and tweak assumptions as necessary. That's how I would start with pipeline. And then the next piece, which for us is more relevant because our enterprise cycle just takes a little bit longer, is we try to see what is the best pipeline that's generated. When do we think that's going to close? And we have assumptions like, is it a 2 months later, or is it a percentage in the first month, or whatever it is? And that part can get a bit messy. So again, really varies on the business. But once we get a pipeline close number, then that gives us some idea of what you find a conversion ratio to that to get your revenue. So there are a couple.
Are those conversion rates? I know they get messy and they vary. Are they more historically based? Like we look at the last 3-4 months and we just see. I can see where there's some discomfort there. But honestly, like, I mean, what else are you gonna do? Like other than just like apply a number just because? Like I think that's kind of the only option you have is to base it on what's gone on in the past and hope for the best.
Exactly. We do also look at what a target conversion could spit out, and that gives us an idea, and you work backwards to figure out, okay, if we get to this target, then we only need to create this much of pipeline. And so you're hoping what you're trying to do is you give your stakeholders a range so they can gives them at least a few levers they can pull. They can either improve their conversion ratio or they need to, which gives them some relief on dollar pipeline.
Yep. Love all this. I appreciate you going deep on this because, the last thing I want to do is have a conversation about this, which is just like exactly what the most basic like bullet points would be. And so I really appreciate you kind of digging into how you think about this. I think it's most helpful to anybody listening and that needs to do this as well. So this is great. I want to switch gears to headcount planning because we, as a company and as somebody who does the content at this company, talk a lot about top line planning. It's everybody's like main focus. It's like the hot topic because that's your revenue and like everybody wants to talk about revenue. But what I've heard from our CS team that they all have finance backgrounds is that headcount planning is the process that nobody in finance really ever wants to do or talk about, but is that like absolutely crucial to what the company does because it's so much of the company's spend. And so we just don't talk that much about the process. And so I would love to hear from you like more about what that process is. I know you said you're planning at the individual level right now. Like what's the end-to-end headcount planning process and like how do you go about modeling it? I would love anything you can provide an insight into that.
First of all, I would say it is continuous and consistent.
Yeah.
And it is, I don't think I've been at a company where it is clean and straightforward. There's so many nuances with that. My general take on all of this, I have learned to work really closely with the executive team, the ops, HR team. If you have like a talent acquisition in your HR team, then definitely that team. And the reason is there's inevitably going to be multiple sheets floating around here, right? Your recruiting team has a sheet of what open recs they have. Your ops team have their plan based on, whatever now they need. And your executive team is trying to figure out like how to plan for 12 months or whatever it may be. So with that, you need to have a source of truth. And so I like to think that finance at least owns the headcount, overarching headcount plan. And so basically my job is to make sure that I have the latest figures all the time and that I communicate these numbers back out to the team so that they have, the right numbers. That's the hardest piece. And then also it doesn't happen so much at startups, it happens a lot more when I was at larger companies where it's movement. Because instead of you see this a lot in like CS because for example, CS rep might CS a job for 12 months and then they might want to move to another part of the organization. Manager are actually our SDRs typically are only in the role for 12 to 18 months and then they move into other roles and that's part of career trajectory and professional development. And so all of that movement has to get reflected in template and it opens up breadth. Filter roles. It just gets really easy. We don't have that issue as much at a startup because with 100 people, it's a little easier to manage that. But that's the biggest. I would say that's the hardest part. And then the other piece is aligning on what hires. And this is where there's a little bit of jostling, top team. Do you really need the CSM or do you really, near or things like that? Or do you really want a mid-market rep or really build out the enterprise? Questions like that. And we revisit this on a weekly basis. And I would say, I think even in my previous experiences, it was still weekly, just because the numbers constantly. And then once you have everything else, it's a little bit easier to get big benefits, but by and large, like that number. And then seniority, why like that affects compensation, but those are numbers like pretty much every HR has comp band. So once you figure out whether this person's a manager or director, let's figure out. So that part is pretty straightforward. I would say it's the number and the count that
I got hung up on weekly because that just sat like, I think basically I was trying to write an article one time about
Yeah.
headcount planning. I was like, oh, like this is important. Like I'll write an article. So I grabbed one of our CS reps who has been a financial analyst before. And I was like, hey, like he just walked me through the process and his eyes rolled back so far in his head. And he's like, oh my God, don't take me back to those days. So I could just imagine like weekly conversations trying to figure this out. It sounds very complicated, very difficult. I'm curious, like, is there anything from the finance seat that you can do to help kind of guide like the who we should hire? Because that sounds like the biggest part of that weekly conversation. Like,
Yeah.
that's what you mentioned about, like, obviously that's up to, you know, the CS leader knowing like what they need, but is there anything you can do to help that
For
process as a
sure.
finance?
I need some benchmark, little less relevant at a startup just because you're building your focus on that. At larger companies, you generally have a sense of what the percentage you want your income statement to be across R&D, sales and marketing, G&A, and cost. And so usually, since headcount is 78% of cost, you can use these for like margins basically to give you some idea of what's appropriate. And all you're trying to look for is that you're not completely out of whack. You're really spending, 70% of your head in G&A, things like that. Otherwise, and at startups, the numbers are just different. A lot of these do publish, there are like surveys across the startups. That data is public, it's out there, and certainly good benchmarking. The other piece, and this particularly relates to sales, and is how that translates to revenue. So, for example, every sales rep has a brand, varies depending on your product, size of company, process, but let's say it's anywhere from 6 months. When you hire that person in seat, you're not going to get revenue from that person. You're carrying that cost out. And so, just a particular startup, we're sensitive to every hire we bring in. You do see that financial impact immediately, and then what you're hoping is that person produces when they're fully ramped. But I take that ramp, I take a hard look at that because often, for some reason, it's always seems like reps take longer to ramp than what's in the plan. And so I track, when things start producing, how much revenue they're bringing relative to what I forecasted, and that gives me some sense of what I need to push out the ramp to work on. And I would say that is, for us, it's very critical just because of how fast we're trying to scale our go-to-market.
Yeah, we've talked about the same topic here. We wrote an article, and I learned a lot about how complicated it is to actually, one, to figure out what, I think it sounded like a lot of teams just say like, like we'll set it at 3 months and we'll build our model, assuming that like they do 25%, then 50%. And it's like, that's great, but like, does it actually happen in practice? And so what I have heard and what I'm hearing now is that, as the finance person, you have all that data so you can actually see like when they start producing. And so you get the real number of the ramp time, not the like idealized, like, yeah, we hired them and then like in 4 months it'll be fine. So really like kind of hearing how that impacts the headcount planning process, because it just sounds like a really tough thing to do, and don't envy all of you people in finance.
It is, and
honestly.
it's one of those things where in hiring it's tough because once you hire the person, you'll want to let go of the person, right? So it reduces the financial flexibility. So and every hire impacts your cash burn. So you just have to be very thoughtful around the timing of when you bring in that person.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I have one more headcount planning question. I just looked at the time and I was like, oh man, I'm eating up a lot of Jenny's time. So I appreciate you bearing with me. Are there areas, so obviously this is a very complex process, the headcount planning piece of the model. Are there areas where the headcount planning model often goes wrong, or in your experience are like the most nuanced where, if we get this piece wrong, it kind of breaks the whole thing? I'm curious, what are those inflection points that people get wrong often?
My answer is probably not what you think I'm going to say. It's communication.
Ooh.
So it's not getting full alignment across all your finance, HR, your executives, PA. That, I would say, is by far the number one, way that headcount planning goes wrong. I can't tell you the number of hours I've spent, luckily not at Sprig, reconciling headcount across different sheets. And so, and that's, believe it or not easy, because for better or for worse, regardless of the team size, a lot of this is still back in Excel. And, there is software out there that does decision management. There's probably software out there, and for whatever reason, a lot of teams still track this manually. So that's probably the biggest issue. And when you don't have alignment across the numbers, it makes it difficult. Obviously your forecast could be thrown off. Your CA might not be chasing the right number of roles that you need. So it just makes it really tricky. The other piece I would say that I see as a general hit all is the lead time from when recruiting starts and when the employees start. And I like to call it like buttons. We often underestimate the lead time issue. So headcount plans are generally more aggressive, which puts, unfortunately, our talent acquisition conflict behind. That's cool. It benefits us from a cost standpoint, because obviously the hire doesn't come in until later, or they realize that was doing much work.
Yep.
But if it's a sales hire, then that delay in the campaign capacity has an implication. So generally, I would say, regardless whether you're a startup or you're a publicly traded company, your sales hire probably takes a big chunk of your engineering. So that's the piece that I'm very careful with.
Yeah, I think that all makes sense. The idea about reconciling the headcount across like 5 different, probably more than 5, a lot of different sheets is daunting. And obviously, like, if your sales leader is like, I have it right here in the spreadsheet, we're going to hire 8 new reps. And then talent acquisition is like, we had 3. And finance is like, well, we had 6. So where are we all at? And so, just I'm getting a feel for why our CS rep was so not thrilled that I wanted to ask him a million questions about headcount planning, because it sounds like
pretty
a lot.
tedious.
So,
And the only solution I found that's tactically that's helpful is weekly thing, just getting people in the room and talking through it. I haven't really found a way to automate. Could be a new startup idea.
Can't automate conversations.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not the part of the job that you can automate away for sure. Cool. I have 2 more questions for you, and I want to kind of sum up the modeling side of things that we've been talking about. And again, appreciate like the depth of information that you've been giving. But broadly, like, I don't know how long it's been since you built this out. Months, I believe. I can't remember.
In February.
So we've had this since about February. I don't know if that's enough time to notice, but I'm curious, what are like any benefits that Sprig has enjoyed, the feedback you've gotten, maybe from Sean, because Sean was so excited about it, just about building this flexibility into the operating model. What does Sprig get as a company because you did it? Yeah,
I think Sean can probably explain this better than I think. He saw it before and after. Yeah. I think from just my interactions with various members on the first benefit, having one source for all financial data. So now, I can become a go-to person, and the model is go-to for any metric that's financial related. Burn, your match number, your growth margin, whatever it may be. The second, I would say, is just the ability to run different cases. So with our business model, we were making changes. We're trying to test different things, and we're taking different price points and running different cases through the model. It's helpful just to see what the range of outcomes are. And we weren't able to do that before. And if it's not consolidated, you can't really see how the different metrics shake out. So I think that's the key. And I can do it live, generally, assuming that it's already modeled in that way. And if I want different revenue cases, I can just switch toggles pretty quickly. And that's helpful because, I'm on the call with our executive team. They're making decisions. Should we go into this hire this person. I see. I can get that feedback to them quite quickly. And so I think that's probably a tool that they might not have had, at the before. And then the third is general comfort in the forecast. I would say the accuracy of the forecast, and it's difficult with a startup, but generally, within range, like the margin for error is in an appropriate level for where we're at. And I don't know if I don't know if that was the case before, but just because of all the different builds and detail I have in the model, and we're a subscription business, so it's recurring revenue. You have some level of comfort that revenue kind of fee is going to trend a certain way. So I think that's the third one.
That's all great. I'm sure it's a huge advantage to the executive team. I'm sure Sean is very appreciative to have it versus before when they did not. And I think it all goes back to something you said at the beginning, which is that the financial model is really a tool for running the business. And something I've heard time and time again is like, it's very common for financial models just to become like this exercise in putting together a spreadsheet, and then no one looks at it and it's like, okay, well, like we did it, but what was all that time for? And so it sounds like you've really everything we've talked about is like an approach to build it in a way that you can actually use day to day and guide the business forward, which is what you want. So love all that. I have one last question for you. It is super broad, so no more modeling, no more anything unless you want it to be, but more on the career side. What is one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you started your finance career?
Yeah. Well, I started my career in professional service, not corporate finance.
Yep.
So I need all the different functions and teams that exist on the operating side. For example, like marketing. There's marketing analytics, there's content, there's social, there's so many different things out there. And I wish I was more aware of those career paths, even in finance. For example, I once thought that in order to be a CFO, I had to have been an accountant. So I wrote that off, as a career when I first started. And that might have been true maybe a decade ago, but the office of the CFO has changed a lot in the last 10 years. There are rules now that didn't exist before, like strategic finance, for example. I'm seeing more and more of that. That wasn't as popular, right?
We love that here.
Exactly. So perhaps I could have been a bit more strategic with my experiences. That was the experiences I wanted to get early in my career. But, now I know. So I guess part of the journey.
Yeah, I mean, things change. It's I thought the same thing. I was like, oh, well, I was like an English major in school.
Yeah.
So it was like, oh, what are you going to be? It was like, you're going to be a teacher. It's like, I don't want to be a teacher. And I'm like, well, I don't know what you're going to do then. And I don't know if you told me when I started that path that I was going to end up here doing a podcast with Jenny from Sprig about finance, like that's just not, it was not going to be on my radar. And so I guess like just being more open to different paths and opportunities, because like there's a lot of different ways to get to where you want to get to. So I think that's really great advice. I think it's a good one. Cool. Well, I've taken up enough of your time. So again, very much appreciated. Loved getting to chat with you about all this, but I wanted to give you the stage. Where can people go to find out more about Sprig? Where can people connect with you, learn more about the work you're doing, ask questions if you're open to them? Stage is yours.
Absolutely. You can definitely learn more about Sprig. We're at sprig.com, SPRIG. And I'm on LinkedIn, Jenny Jao. You can find me pretty easily. Love that. Happy to nerd out on finance things and professional development, whatever it may be. You definitely an open door. So look forward to connecting.
Amazing. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time. It was great to have you on the Roll Forward, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Likewise. Thank you for having me. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for checking out this episode of The Roll Forward. This show is powered by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow The Roll Forward wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Or visit mosaic.tech/podcast to get immediate access to all of the latest episodes.